Hello, welcome to Diversity Dialogues, where each week we post useful content on all matters concerning diversity and inclusion. My name is Elizabeth Lang, founder and CEO of Diversity Focus. So today I'd like to bring to you a topic that I believe is quite important, and this is the topic of some of the barriers that exist to diversity and inclusion in the workplace. If this is your first time tuning in, welcome. This is my second video. Last week I posted about the 3 benefits of diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and in particular, how workplaces can foster inclusive workplace cultures. So today I'd like to talk about some of the barriers that might hinder some of those approaches that companies will often put in place around diversity. Now, we know the world of work as we know it has dramatically changed within just the last couple of weeks. With the current situation of the coronavirus, the world of work as we know it has been completely shifted. And the notion of working from home, which was once considered a luxury only afforded to the few, has now become the norm for millions of people around the world. So with that in mind, we know that the world of work is changing, and we know that particularly employers are now in a position where they're reflecting on how to innovate, on how to address the changes, and how to continue to maintain their working environments in light of the current changes. So I guess in that spirit of reflection, I'd like to encourage people to think about this notion of cultivating workplace cultures of respect and inclusion, and in particular some of the barriers that stand in the way of actually achieving that. For people in management, this is a time and a space to reflect on management practices and whether they're in line with the principles of inclusion, of equity, and if not, what are some approaches that you can begin to put in place to address some of those issues should I say when things go back to normal. But even now that people are working remotely, there's things that people can do to foster a sense of inclusion. Now, matters of diversity and inclusion are a workplace issue. They're an issue that concern employee well-being and employee welfare. And organizations and companies are well placed to begin to reflect on practices that currently exist and whether they're serving their employees. And if not, what are some steps that can be put in place to begin to address some of those challenges? I think in particular, when we think about the notion of a lack of diversity and inclusion, some of the barriers that might exist, for some organizations, it may be that frameworks, policies and procedures around diversity and inclusion may not be in place. And if that is not in policy, it's very difficult to implement in practice. But I think for a lot of companies and organizations, it's probably the second point where they may exist in theory, but they're not practiced on the ground on a daily basis. And I think that that's a space that a lot of companies and organizations sit in. So it's about reflecting on why is it that we have these fantastic frameworks and policies in writing, but in practice they're not being adhered to. So because it has an impact on organizational culture. When organizational cultures are not defined by respect and equity, that leads to many, many other issues that can hinder effective approaches to diversity and inclusion. It may also be that for some organizations, there's a lack of leadership around diversity and inclusion. And I think the old adage that you can't preach what you don't practice is very true here, because employees will not necessarily follow the rhetoric, but they'll follow what they see being done in practice. And I think it's about reflecting on how can organizational policies and procedures and the frameworks that might be put in place by various organizations and businesses, how can they translate into practice on the ground? And it's about thinking about how do we foster workplace cultures that are characterized by respect and inclusion. Because when workplace cultures become toxic and when people do not feel safe at work, and you start to have issues like backstabbing, you start to have issues where people feel like they're not being supported, you start to have issues where employees feel like it's not a safe working environment. And I think when people don't feel safe at work, that has an impact naturally on their performance. So it has a huge bearing on organizational performance, both at an individual level, but also at a collective levels, such as how teams might operate more effectively. And some of the outcomes of this can be quite dangerous, because when employees are not satisfied at work, that has an impact on their overall stress levels, which people naturally do carry into their personal lives. And a study done by Statistics Canada indicated that 62% of the people that were interviewed indicated that the main source of stress on their lives was due to work. So it makes sense that, considering the fact that we spend a huge chunk of our lives at work, that naturally the impact of our working lives impacts on the other aspects of our personal lives as well, such as on other interpersonal relationships outside of the work. In an article I read recently published by Forbes magazine, it provided a case study of an organization that recognized that it had a lack of diversity and inclusion, and it wanted to begin the process of change by attracting a diversity of candidates. So what the organization did was they embarked on a process of change where they began with conducting an internal audit. And the internal audit identified some of the barriers that the company had in place, and it provided them with a blueprint to begin to address some of those barriers. Now, you can't cultivate a diverse workplace environment if you don't firstly create an environment that is welcoming to diversity of candidates. So through this internal audit, they identified some of the challenges that stood in their way, and they began the process of actually starting to look at what are some of the solutions might be. And that was, so firstly what they did was they held a workshop with their employees, and it provided a space where people can honestly reflect and share on what they thought was working, but also what wasn't working, and some of the ideas that could be put in place to begin the change process. And I know that conversations about diversity and inclusion can be uncomfortable, but it's about being able to sit with that discomfort and to use that as a learning moment or as a teaching moment to be able to move forward as an organization. So following the workshop, this organization then facilitated a dialogue with the employees where they asked employees to come up with different ideas on what they thought was important to facilitating an inclusive workplace environment. And those ideas were taken and then put into a mission and statement and a goal around justice, diversity, and inclusion. And that created a statement that showed, I guess, the organization's dedication to diversity and inclusion, but it also had with it some of the steps that needed to be taken in terms of the goals to actually implement it. But the statement itself was important because it was something that the organization then put on their website. They also promoted it through, for example, the job description forms and other documentation. So it really showed the public and potential candidates their commitment to diversity inclusion. The third thing that this organization did was change their recruitment practices. Because you can't attract a diversity of candidates if you continue to use the same old recruitment tactics that created a lack of diversity in the first place. And I think this is an important one because most organizations will say that they have a will to innovate, to change, to have a diverse workplace environment, etc. And yes, that might well be written in policies and procedures, but some of the practices around recruitment are not actually facilitating that change. So it's about thinking about how can recruitment practices at a management level be changed to ensure that we are able to get the new outcomes that we're seeking. And I sort of think of Einstein's quote where he says, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. And I think that this quote rings so true to this context, because many times organizations will profess that they have a will to change, that they have a will to foster inclusive cultures, to increase diversity of representation of women, for example, of people from minority groups. But the challenge really is, what are some of the recruitment practices in place, and do they actually facilitate that change that you desire to have? That brings us to the end of today's video. I'd like to thank you for tuning in. I'd also encourage you to like and to leave a comment below if any of what I've shared with you resonated, If you're currently going through some of the challenges that I might have spoken about or have in the past, and maybe how you've dealt with those as well, because that could be useful for people that may also be going through similar situations. I'd also like to encourage you to also subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can be updated when I next upload the video next week. So thank you and take care. Bye.